Brilliant. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you. I'm going to talk today about my research with first-generation Bangladeshi women in Tower Hamlets. I'll try and keep it a little bit shorter so that we can try and catch up with the agenda again. So just to run you very quickly through what I'm going to talk about. I'll talk about my research, how it came about, where the ideas were from. I'll quickly fly through some of the demographics on the Bangladeshi community. I assume the previous speakers may have covered it, so I'll go through that very quickly. And then I'll look at why I'm interested in Bangladeshi older women and why I think that should be a very firm part of the research agenda on migrant communities and integration of different communities in the UK. I'll then look at some of the discussions around ageing and then go on to the changes in the community, which is the biggest part of my talk today. And the main features of that really are the family and how that has transformed over generations and how that has impacted people's sense of belonging and their interaction with place. It's really nice to see familiar faces. Sorry, I've just spotted John. John knows my work from... Oh!
15
No. And so the study, it's a qualitative longitudinal study. So a very long time ago, around 2000, I came to Tower Hamlets for the first time and was appointed as a researcher to look at the experiences of first-generation Bangladeshi women. At that time, because there was a recognition that we didn't know anything about them in the literature. We didn't know very much about Bangladeshis full stop, but we knew very, very little about the older women. And so there was a sense that we needed to collect some life histories, and that's what I was appointed to do. And so I spoke to over 100 women that we recruited from GP surgeries across the borough, so quite a big spread, randomly selected. Before that, I did focus groups and exploratory interviews, so quite a lot of women were involved in that. And then I interviewed them all in their homes for about 1 to 3 hours, depending on how long they took, all in Sylheti. All of these were then transcribed and written up by myself for analysis. And then about 10 years later, I decided that it would be fascinating to follow up some of the women. And because so much had changed, Tower Hamlets is constantly in a state of change. But in that 10 years, I thought, wouldn't it be great to know what had happened? Because at the time that I'd interviewed them in 2001, they all had fairly young children. And they were all at that age of 10, 12 at school. And I thought, well, what have happened to their children now? What about the way they're represented in the stats? So we went back and followed up just 20 of the women. They were aged 35 to 55 in the first sample, and obviously 10 years later, 10 years older. And this age group represents the first wave of big, large-scale migration of Bangladeshi women from Tower Hamlets, from Bangladesh, sorry. And so the last of the South Asian groups to complete family reunification, and we see this represented in the stats. They tend to be about 10, 15 years behind other South Asian groups who arrived earlier. Last census tells us there's about 450,000 people of Bangladeshi origin in the UK. This covers everyone from new arrivals to long-established second and third generations like myself. They make up just over 0.5% of the population, a very small but significant community that are now getting very, very settled in the UK. Overwhelmingly a young age profile. The rise in numbers of the Bangladeshi community are much more to do with family size than they are to do with new arrivals into the country. Migration from Bangladesh was very much a staged migration, with men arriving first during the 60s and into the early 70s, and typifying the economic male migrant who had come to amass some money and then had every intention of returning home once they'd gotten enough money. Of course, this kind of never was quite enough, and as they realised that their stay was going to be long-term, certainly not permanent, but they thought it's going to be a bit longer than we had anticipated, families were then brought over, and so women began to arrive in the 70s and into the early 80s. Majority from the northeastern district of Sylhet, and 54% of Bangladeshis in the UK reside in London, with the largest proportion in this particular borough of Tower Hamlets, which is why most of the research we do on Bangladeshis tends to occur in this borough. So why first-generation women? They've been largely neglected in the literature. Their experiences haven't really been documented. There's been a lot of research, really brilliant research, on second-generation women, which looks at issues around education, about employment, about their religiosity, about their aspirations for different things. And whilst this is all really good stuff, what it does is that it implies that the second generation are very fluid, they're very active, they negotiate their identities and their spaces, but that then implies that the first generation don't, that they're somehow stuck. There's no point in researching them because they don't change, they don't have aspirations around education and employment. Their religion is fixed. We don't need to look at them because we know that there's nothing really there to research. But of course that's not the case. Where there has been research on first generation, largely looked at men's experiences. So really brilliant work by Caroline Adams and Yusuf Chowdhury's work in Birmingham, which has collected beautiful, detailed, rich stories of men's experiences when they arrive in this country. And there are exceptions. Katie Gardner does a lot of work with both older men and women. And we have, in the last sort of 10 or 15 years, seen what's been termed the feminization of migration. And a large focus of migration studies have started to look at women's experiences of migration. And this in itself, the feminization of migration, is a bit of a misnomer. We know that women have been migrating in roughly the same numbers as men from the 1950s onwards. So this idea of suddenly looking at gender and migration, it's more that the research agenda has decided to focus on women's experiences. But it's a very different cohort of women it looks at. It explores the experiences of female economic migrants now. So it looks at things like trafficking of women, or women who travel abroad to work as nurses, women who leave their children behind in the care of a parent while they go and care for someone else. So valuable and fabulous research. But it's not really the women that I'm interested in. It's not family reunification migrants. And where older people are included in research, it tends to be around issues of illness. It's pan chewing, it's tobacco, it's diabetes, it's their lack of integration, it's their dependence on welfare. And again, what this does is that it problematizes the community. It problematizes older Asian women by saying it's all about negative terms. They're not integrating, they don't speak the language, they're always ill, they're constantly leeching off the system. So there's no positive research around older communities. And it's really important to study that experience of women because family reunification remains the main mode of entry into the UK. And as immigration laws get more and more restrictive, this is still the biggest way that people come and settle. And for me, Bangladeshi women migrated at a really precipitous time. It was a unique time in the history of migration studies. They knew nothing about where they were coming from and where they were coming to. So a lot of my respondents came from agricultural rural areas. They weren't familiar with things like electricity or even two-story houses when they came to this country. Today's migrants are far, far more savvy. They may not have migrated, but they've heard stories of the country here. They've seen everything from initially chain migration, people going back showing stories, and then there were video cassettes of weddings. Then we have this explosion in global communication and international TV stations. So of course, it's a gilded and unrealistic expectation that they have of what the West is, and this is evidence in the kind of gifts that they expect people to take back for them. But it's still an idea. They know what people dress like. They know what white people look like. They know, they've got that idea. When my respondents came to this country, they had no idea, and they were completely shocked by just the way buildings looked, the way streets were. And so it's a very important time, and also politically in the geopolitics. At the time, Bangladesh was just emerging out of a really bloody independence war, and a lot of the women spoke about that. They spoke about the uncertainty of that time. Some of them had husbands that went missing during the war, some of them got married just around that time, so it was a very difficult time in their lives as well. And also they arrived into the UK at a time of recession, tightening legislation, and increasing hostility towards migrants, and not entirely dissimilar to the situation that a lot of migrant groups now are faced with. They're leaving behind very tumultuous situations in their homelands and coming into an area where there's massive hostility to new arrivals. And I think that's why, whatever happens, it's important that we look at these experiences, because history repeats itself, and there's always the same things. There's nothing new that ever occurs, so we're constantly experiencing the same thing, just repackaged in a different way. And if we can learn lessons, then that's a really important thing that we can do. And because of women's roles as the universal bearers of culture and tradition. So older women have been living in the UK forever, since the 70s, absolutely quietly, all Asian older women, migrant women, and nobody had batted an eyelid, nobody even thought about them. They were keeping quiet, they were keeping themselves to themselves, so we weren't interested. But then suddenly, we had the Northern Riots in 2001, and nobody could really understand why that happened. Now, for those of us who work in academia, it pretty much made sense, and it was inevitable, and there were parallels that can be drawn to the riots that happened in Brixton in the 80s. It's about disenchantment, it's about people feeling really lost and frustrated and expressing their frustrations in the way that they could. However, it kind of led to a massive raft of legislation around citizenship, because why are people who are born in this country, who speak the language, why are they rioting? What on earth have you got to riot about? How lucky are you to be living in this country? So if you are rioting, then you're not fully appreciating what you've been given. You're not taking the full appreciation of your citizenship. So your citizenship is somehow not in place. You're lacking something. So we start to look at citizenship and who deserves it and how it can happen. And the idea was that the lack of feelings that the second generation young men had, it must be something to do with their mothers. And there was this association made with the lack of integration of older women and the riots. And how that was made was by the associating it with language, was that they must be taught something in the home that is making them not feel part of British society, because society is fine. It can't be the structural problems. There was no examination of the fact that there is poor access to jobs, that there's lack of resources in these northern towns, that people are increasingly feeling frustrated. That wasn't part of the agenda at all. The link was made with women, and Anne Cryer, who was an MP for Keighley at the time, she made that association very clearly by saying that if there is poverty, it's the Pakistanis' fault because they import poverty when they bring those wives over. So through that transnational marriage, they're bringing their poverty over. It's not Bradford. It's not the fact that there are no jobs and there's no poor housing and the educational system is rubbish and teachers don't want to go and teach there. It's the fact that they bring these wives over and then they don't speak English in the house. And then the second generation don't really speak English very well. And then, of course, they're not going to get jobs. So that was the way that the argument was then presented, and that's what made the discourse on citizenship focus so heavily on the English language. And then, of course, we went on to the global scene, and geopolitically there's lots of issues that affect identification of the second generation. And we had things like the 7/7 bombings, and now we're witnessing this increasing radicalisation. And again, in the discourses, in the policy, nobody seems to understand why young people are being radicalised. It's not looked at on a bigger scale in terms of where it sits in the global international field of different types of policies, etc., that affect people. It's again being taken into the home. It's being linked to things like language and home life. And since 2001, English language has become symbolic of citizenship, and it's being used increasingly to regulate citizenship and who belongs, who doesn't belong. And if you speak English, then of course you are more progressive and you are more likely to integrate. And of course, speaking English has lots and lots of values, and this is something that everybody appreciated, but it's certainly not the only way to integrate. And whilst these citizenship policies are about people who are arriving new, who they really affect disproportionately are women from low literacy countries, people that I have worked with. And it takes no account of the fact that a lot of the people who are applying for citizenship, who are arriving through family reunification, have no literacy in their own mother tongue, and they've got no experience of education. So if you don't have that formative experience of education, of learning, of applying that knowledge, how are you then expected to learn a new language? It's incredibly restrictive on people. It takes no account of people's own cultural and religious frameworks. And one of the things that we know is that if you want to understand how any person or any group is going to settle in a different country, whether it's a Brit going to Spain, whether it's Bangladeshis coming here, or Afghanis going somewhere to America, the only thing you need to look at is where they are coming from. The experiences that they have, their cultural norms, their gender norms, their social norms, that is what is going to predict how they'll behave in the country that they go to. If you are not used to speaking to anybody outside of your family, as my respondents were, they lived in little villages, had no encounters with anyone who wasn't their family. When you come to a different country, regardless of what your opportunities are, you don't have those scripts. You've never felt okay doing that, so that will take time to develop. And this has massive implications for citizenship discourse and policies. You can't expect people who have never engaged outside of the home, who've never engaged in learning, to suddenly use those resources just because they're there, just because you say they should. So you need to have some understanding that these things take time. Opportunities are brilliant to have, but people will make use of them as and when they feel comfortable to take those up. And when people don't, so as soon as they don't come and take up language classes, the women I spoke to didn't take up language classes for the best part of 20 years because it wasn't right for them. It wasn't right in terms of their cultural frameworks, and it wasn't right in terms of the support that they had. With a previous speaker was talking about intergenerational families. When my respondents arrived, they didn't have mothers they could leave their kids with and go to language classes. They had to look after their kids themselves. So it was only when the kids were out of the home that they could then go and do those language classes. But because they didn't take them up there and then, as was expected by those providing them, they were positioned as somehow unwilling to learn and therefore undeserving of citizenship. And they're sort of constructed as backwards because of this. And this has gone on for forever. Because they don't speak language, they must be completely backwards and they must be problematic, and they clearly don't want to integrate. Now, the work that I've done with people shows that integration is very key to their sense of belonging, but it's not based on purely language. Every single woman that I spoke to wanted to speak English and spoke about how much it would change their life. But they also spoke about how well they got on with their neighbours. I said, I don't understand them, but we say hello. And then they'd give them food during Ramadan and things like that. So there was always positive engagement with their neighbours, but it wasn't based on language. And so the discussions around citizenship tend to insinuate that older women are expressing a very sinister and dark message within the homestead. And this symbolic association with language and citizenship has been repeated again and again in the literature, that there's something about language that suggests that people are deserving or not deserving. Now, looking at ageing, which is one of my interests, Migrant says that we're aged more by culture than by chromosomes. And I think this is absolutely true, because our ideas about ageing are different and very, very much socially constructed. And so what if we're exposed to more than one culture? What if you come from a culture where ageing is defined in one way, and then you end up in a different culture where ageing identities are completely different? In the UK, 50 is the new 40, and we're forever young. So what if you find yourself in that situation? Do you have a choice about which ageing identity you take on? And are those choices then bounded? So are you allowed to make certain choices in a situation? So, for example, if I'm a young person and I want to get a job, am I allowed to get a job? Or do I have to work within a certain geographical area because that's all I'm allowed to do by my parents? Am I allowed to go to university, but only if it's on my doorstep and I can stay at home and retain all those our cultural traditions? So that's what we mean by bounded choices. And are those choices fixed in time and place? Because ethnographic literature tends to suggest that they are. So when we have research done on Bangladeshis or older Sikh women and the like, that's a piece of literature, and that'll sit there and will be referred to again and again for 10 years, as if those people never change. So when my women in 1980 decided that they didn't want to do language classes because they were too busy looking after their kids, 1995, they were very happy to take language classes. So those choices were not fixed in time and place. They were much more about the changes that happened in place facilitated the choices. So that's why the type of research that I do, longitudinal, which goes back to look at the same people in a different time and measure the changes that have happened, are really important to understand how communities change. Otherwise, we end up propagating the same kind of stereotypical assumptions about different groups. Now, the United Nations, there's a universal definition of older people, which suggests that 60 is kind of the universally accepted age for when we are older. And this is really important. We do need categories in all aspects of life, in academia, in social policy. We work out our pensions and things according to them, and access to health services. But they're not permanent. They're very much permeable, as we've seen with the change in pension ages and retirement ages. But what Sharon Ray's rather brilliant work found was that different ethnic groups identify themselves different ways in regards to aging, and she found that British Pakistani people, women, identified themselves as being middle-aged when they were about 30 or 40 years old. And this is unheard of in other cultures, certainly in the British culture, where you'd be middle-aged when you're sort of about 50 years old, so certainly 15 to 20 years later. And for the Pakistani women, they were older when they were 45. So traditionally, when the Western people she was talking to, the British white people, were identifying themselves as going into middle age from 45 to 50 onwards. So very much a difference there. And so it might be more appropriate, rather than thinking about chronological aging, to think about aging by experience. And this for a number of reasons. Certainly for minority communities and lots of different cultures across the world where people didn't keep records, and certainly Bangladeshis that I look at, the earlier generation, there were no records, and this is still the case in lots and lots of different parts of the world, in different African communities, etc., and rural communities particularly. There's no systemized record keeping of when people are born and their ages. And a lot of the people that I spoke to aged in reference to something else. So they would talk about being born after partition, or they got married 2 years before independence, their children were born. So there was always a reference point rather than an actual date. And what happens in many parts of the world outside of Europe is that people are aged by their experience. So you acquire aging status, you acquire adulthood when you get married. And then that becomes elevated again when you become a parent. When you become a grandparent, that's when you've kind of achieved old age. Now, when we're looking at communities and cultures where people get married very young, as did my first generation respondents, they were getting married around 15, 16, some younger, some a bit older, and the generation before them, again, younger still. So at one point, there were people who were getting married very young, having children young, 14, 15 years old, having their first children. Their children went on to have children when they were in their mid-teens. So I had women who were grandmothers around 30 years old, and that's very, very young. And so they would adopt an aging identity that was performative and that was based on dress. And so what we would find in Asian cultures, and certainly Bangladeshi and Muslim cultures, is that men would start to grow a beard, not because of religiosity, but because they were a grandfather now. And so they were respected elder persons. So that's how they communicated their elder status, was by the adoption of a beard. Women would start to cover their hair when they were a grandmother. They would change the tone of their colour of the clothes that they wore and wore more muted colours because they were now elder and expressed their status, and people would respect that and recognise their status based on the way that they presented themselves. So it's about experience and about performity, the way that people perform their different identities. And we construct our aging based on the social and cultural situations and spaces we find ourselves in and the networks that we're embedded in. And so if I'm around people who are very young, then I'll act young because that's what my norm is. If I'm around older people and people who expect me to behave older, then we will, as some of the quotes I'll show. So this is just one of the things I wanted to show you. It's about sort of constructions of aging, and this is what the literature tells us. And it's quite generalized. But a lot of the Western discourses on aging view aging really negatively. And so it's all about decline and a series of losses, a loss of mobility, a loss of looks, a loss of meaningful roles, and a loss of networks and friendships. You become very isolated. And any signs of aging that you show are identified as markers of failure. So we're constantly trying to keep young, look young, dress young. Whereas in Bangladesh, the research from Katie Gardner suggests that actually aging isn't always about decline. There are ideas about power and prestige, and as people age, they retain the power. So they move into, a working man will move into the head of household role, where he steps back from the duties of providing for his family because the next generation will do that, but he retains the respect. So he will be asked for his permission, he will be asked for his advice. Similarly, the woman no longer runs the household. It's expected a daughter-in-law will do this, and she will take on the role of matriarch of the house. And they are still consulted on issues. Whether their advice is taken or not, it's always asked whether people are buying homes or cars. They ask their parents. Now, this is, of course, generalized, and it doesn't happen all the time, and there are changes, but that's the general sort of distinction. So I'm going to give you start with some quotes. And this is what I mean about performative identity. What Zaima says here is, it would be very different in Bangladesh. If I was in Bangladesh now, people would say I was very old, and I would be different if I was living there. If she was living there, she would be, as Stuart Hall talks about identity, she would become old because she was in an environment where everybody else was expecting her to be old. So she'd just become old because that's the expectation and the norms of the society that she was then embedded in. And Asma also says, I forget that I'm getting old. People forget in this country that they're getting old. I've got a daughter who's 23. in Bangladesh, people would be saying, oh, is your daughter not married yet? Mine's got children already. And so there'd be this kind of expectation that somehow she wasn't aging appropriately in her society. And every society has its own cultural scripts and expectations for normalized aging. And so when people should get married, when people should be having children, when people should be retiring. But when people migrate, they're sometimes confronted with different scripts. And what my respondents are doing here is that they're choosing to take on the Western notions of aging and kind of disregard some of the Bangladeshi traditional ones because they're not in Bangladesh anymore. And so they're letting their daughters go to study for further, and they're not worrying about them getting, because it's okay in this country. So they acknowledge that they'd be old if they were in Bangladesh, but here it's not so bad. Now, looking at how the community has changed, the first thing we know is the community has grown. In the 50s, there was about 2,000 Bangladeshis recorded in the census. And then in a 50-year period, 100 times that size. And we're now obviously at 450,000, so massively grown. And largely this is due to chain migration. People were migrating when they knew that it was fine to migrate, it was safe, you weren't going to be eaten by sharks, it was all fine. So people went home, told stories, other people came over. In London, certainly, lots of internal migration. So the size of the community here has grown because as the recession hit during the 70s and 80s and factories and trades and industry closed down in the north and in the Midlands, there was still a fairly active garment trade in East London. So people migrated internally down to London. And of course, we have the practice of transnational marriages. Really interesting, this area. I won't speak about it too much here, but there's this massive imbalance of gendered anomaly when it comes to transnational marriages. More young men go over to get married and bring their wives over than young women go over to bring husbands. Lots of reasons for this. One of them is quite practical. It's about young men aren't educated enough for young girls, and we see this in the stats where girls are doing better than boys. There's also cultural factors, the one that people tend to pick up on. The idea of women as culture bearers, as communicating that culture. So if you bring a wife from back home, she's more likely to stay at home and raise a child and be a dutiful daughter-in-law. This hasn't played out wonderfully for everybody who's decided to go down that route, but it's still a very strong idea. And also family size. As I said, the family size is more, the growth of the community more to do with bigger families than it is about new arrivals. And as the families have grown, we've now got these extended family systems that are quite different. So whereas when people first arrived, they were isolated and maybe through chain migration they had cousins and siblings, they now have their children and they have their grandchildren. So this extended family is growing vertically as well as sort of the horizontal roots that they had originally. As the second generation have settled, they've actually done brilliantly well. The stats on Bangladeshis have been so despondent for so terribly long, and when you read about Bangladeshis in the literature, you'll still find them talked about in terms of disadvantage, of bad education, of lack of integration, lack of engagement in the labour market. But if you then go back and look at the stats now, they've done astronomically well. In a generation, they've done so well. People are going to university, and these are people whose parents haven't been to university. So if you liken them to the working class, traditional working class whose parents never went to university, we now have a generation that are going on not just to get degrees, but subsequent degrees and postgrads and the rest. So a huge jump, much more than we would expect to happen. And we have the relationship between people and place. This is my that sums up my work. I'm really interested in the way that people are transformed by the place that they live in, and they then transform the place that they inhabit. And so we see this in Tower Hamlets better than anywhere else. When people arrived to Tower Hamlets and began to settle, partly the people changed the place, the setting up of groceries and establishing places to pray, and then the establishment of the mosque. But also that then changed the people, because the mosque created this very religious identity and space for people to search out for a more religious space that attracted people to Tower Hamlets. So it began to change the people that were living here as well. And then the council, with its various policies of halal school meals, of incorporating sawar kameez into its school uniform, of allowing hijab to be worn, that changes the people there, because people who might otherwise not be able to wear South Asian clothes into school, because lots of other places outside of London won't allow sawar kameez as a school uniform, it does allow it here. So the people change the place, and the place changes people and makes them into the people that they are. This other quote here that I've got is about family, and Chanel says this very interesting thing, and this again sums up the kind of very rural people that came to this country. People who migrate are not the poorest of the poor, even though they're kind of, when they come to this country, is seen as some sort of peasant class. The poorest of the poor can never afford to migrate. The very rich don't need to migrate. So it's sort of a middle ground of people that come. But she says here, in this country, everyone's your relative. You meet people from all these different parts of Bangladesh that you would never have met. But here, everyone's your relative. Now, this is a very different kind of attitude for somebody who's never really moved from outside of her own family circuit. And post-migration, we see this a lot, that people end up creating networks and making their own family so that they can feel secure. And it's also culturally a very important thing. If you come from a culture where you are discouraged from engaging with people who are not your family, and you're not supposed to talk to men who aren't your brothers and your cousins and your uncles, then if you create a fictive kin network, that bypasses those regulations, and you suddenly have a big family that you can talk to. So this changes the way that the Bangladeshi sort of family structure works as well. And this is very interesting. Regional loyalties, and my respondents talk about this kind of, there's a mirroring of, partly because of chain migration, of where people are in Bangladesh and where they reside in Sylhet. They seem to make up those same communities when they come to this country. And so I've got Shalina here who's saying, oh, the people in the next building, they're different. They're not from the same area as us. We come from Fesigonj, and there's so much love between us, but they're really different. So she won't talk to anyone else who's from a different area. And similarly, then, Ashley goes on to say, she said, oh, everyone here, she talks about Whitechapel and how amazing Whitechapel is, and it's wonderful, and it's got this very distinctive taste. And I was saying, well, what is this taste? How would you know? How would anyone know what it is? And she was saying, you just go out of your house and see. And she said, everyone here is from Bianibazar, and it's just like you leave one and you've come back into Bianibazar. It's fine. You don't have to go back to Bangladesh ever again. Everybody is here now from that area. And this is partly because of chain migration. You come to where you know people. Some of this has a much, quite a political basis as well, with the sort of housing crisis in the 70s and the GLC and the decision of people of where they wanted to be housed. Bangladeshis wanted to be housed together, and particularly regionally, they ended up living quite close together as well. So that's also part of the reason why people have ended up in these concentrated areas. And I saw this throughout town hamlets when I was going to different wards. They were made up of little different areas of Sylhet were replicated there. And whilst this is great for belonging and attachment, and you leave one community and you come into your community again, on a broader scale, it's not that great, because what it can do is that you're so caught up in these regional loyalties that you start breaking away from your bigger picture of this is a Bangladeshi community and we need to unite to push our agenda forward, and as a community we need to raise ourselves. And these things kind of play out in regional politics here as well. So as we see the second generation moving into political aspirations and into the council and going for MPs, a lot of the vote garnering is based on where they're from in Bangladesh. And are they from our area or are they from a different area? And that's really not anything at all to do with politics. It's to do with regional loyalties and identities. And so that's a very different subcurrent that runs through. But whilst the numbers are large enough now for people to break out into their regional groups, the benefit of that is that the community is large enough and has grown large enough to support itself. So when these two quotes talk about the early days, when we talk about integration and people not mixing with the wider community, the early days were horrific for Bangladeshis. Arriving in the 70s and early 80s, when you have the National Front on your doorstep and there are people being beaten up, and just this week we've celebrated or commemorated the murder of Alta Bali. So a really terrible time for people, and that seems to be lost in any analysis and stats of integration. If you spent the first 10 years of your life living under real threats of danger, not just a fear of it, an absolute threat of it, then why integrate? And this goes back to a lot of psychological theories about security and belonging, and Maslow's theory of actualization. It's a really old theory in the 40s, but it basically says that the very first thing as human beings that we need to do is we need to have our basic needs of security met. We need to have food, we need to have water, we need to have our basic needs met. Then we need security and safety and shelter. Most of my respondents arrived into insecure housing, and when they arrived, the way that social housing was at the time, a male migrant who was working in the UK couldn't apply for a house for his family while they were abroad. He had to wait for them to arrive. And once they arrived, they moved into hostels and into temporary housing. And only then, when his family were here, could he apply for a larger house for his family. And then that meant that people were in secure housing for such a long time, in hostile housing, often large families in very small groups. So people then would often take the very first housing that was offered to them, just so that they'd have a space of their own. Usually terrible conditions, and then they'd end up waiting on waiting lists. And I spoke to people who were on waiting lists for 10, 15 years. So how can you ever feel secure if you constantly are thinking that, oh, actually I might move from this? So it's only when you've got that feeling of security that you can feel that you belong in an area, that this is your home. And then you go on to think about, actually, what would I like to do with my life now? So you need that sense of security. And it's taken Bangladeshis the best part of a generation to get there. And now, as Rupa says, there's no risk of any racism here because this is all Bengalis. You need other people to have any of those problems here. And it's been brilliant for the community because, on the one hand, the growth of the community means that my women are fabulously confident now about going out. If you compare this batch of older Bangladeshi first-generation women to somewhere else in the UK where there's not such a concentrated community, it's a very, very different experience. And Saleha talks about how you can go anywhere. You can go into offices and banks and doctors, and there are Bengali-speaking staff. So it's made women very confident about exploring the space by themselves. And Glaba talks about how people are MPs and councillors. So it's not just about somebody helping you when you go to a shop or to the doctors. We know that our people are looking out for us in policy terms, that we're going to be okay now because the councillors and MPs in Tower Hamlets are not going to make policies that will affect us in any bad way. However, such a big community is not always great. Fulkara talks about how when she first came to this country, she was one of the more educated respondents, and so people would come to her and say, oh, can you help me with this letter? Can you read this letter for me? Can you write a letter? And she would do that. But then as the community grew, there were community centres and there were people to do these jobs. There were community workers, so people didn't go to her anymore. And she was saying that now people don't come to me, and so I've lost that skill. And so she started to go to language classes. But when she went out, there was no one there that she could speak English to. So if she went and tried to ask something in English in a shop, they'd respond to her in Bengali, and so on was fine, and they'd answer her in Bengali. So she had nowhere she could practice her language. And when I went back and saw her in 2011, she was saying, well, it's even worse now. Now I'm a complete cripple because now we have Bangla TV. And she was saying, before, I'd have to watch the news, and I'd watch EastEnders, and I'd watch things, and I'd try and understand what they were saying. And so that's how I learnt my language. But now we have Bangla TV. It's just too comfortable. It's just too tempting to watch the news in Bengali rather than watch Newsround. And Newsround is an amazing program. I mean, think of it as a kids program, but the amount of migrants that watch Newsround because it's simple news. It's for children, but the language is simple, the stories are, and they're very short. So a lot of migrants would listen to Newsround to get their news rather than the news at 10 because the news was so simplified. But now we've got Bangla TV, they don't need to do that. And then we have this situation here with Lima, who says, well, the thing is, if you can't talk English, you can't go anywhere. So whilst it's great that there are people who speak Bengali, what if the one person you need to speak Bengali doesn't? So she needs to go to an optician, and the Bengali optician has now closed his shop and moved on. So she was saying, well, now I'm stuck. Where am I supposed to go now for my glasses? I don't know. I need new glasses, but I can't go anywhere. And if I could speak English, then I wouldn't be stuck like this. And whereas before they could take their children to act as interpreters and they would take them out of school, children don't have time for this now. Children have grown up, they've got their own jobs, they've got their own families. More importantly, it might be okay to take an afternoon off when you've got a job, but when you've got family, your annual leave becomes incredibly precious, and so they didn't have time to do that. So women required to go to language classes or go out by themselves and take care of themselves. Family, incredibly important to women, not just for their interpreting role, but also in everything else. Now, migration alters the family dynamics in huge ways. As much as people want to reproduce the family unit, and we see this in every culture that migrates and in every family, the first thing that they try to do is recreate their family unit as best as possible, because we know that it's familiar, especially when you're faced with something that's unfamiliar and terrifying. You just repeat what you know and you do that. but it never really works. It's never fully replicable. There's always some sort of changes in the way that happens. And most often those changes are in power dynamics between men and women, between children and parents. And the children and parents one happens really quite quickly. There's quite a quick dissonance between the cultural adaptation of children and parents, because children go to school. And so they learn the language. And then parents start to rely on their children for that language skill. And they take them to the doctors. And before you know it, the children are interpreting, and they have more power than the parents, because they're telling the parents what the doctors are saying, what the school teachers are saying. If you're taking your parents to parents' evening and you're telling them what your teacher's saying, you could be saying anything. And so there's this big shift in power. When I came back in 2011, the first thing I noticed was the massive, massive change in material circumstances across every single woman that I went and revisited, and across Tower Hamlets. There were huge fancy cars in driveways, houses had been done up, people had bought houses, and there'd been this massive social mobility of the family as a unit. And this was something that I didn't expect to see on the scale that I did. So very quickly, in 2001, 90% of my sample living in social housing or rented accommodation, and only 10% had a mortgage, buying the house with mortgage. When I went back 10 years later, these figures had shifted dramatically. So I had 65% who were renting, and almost a third of the sample were in the process of buying their house. None of my women worked, particularly. There was a couple that had kind of gone into some work, but it wasn't the women that were buying their houses. This was the family. So it was the family obligations that were playing into the changing material circumstances of the family. And one person had bought their house out completely, so 5%. The figures in the last column show there were two respondents, one of whom wanted to buy her house, had the money to buy her house, but wasn't allowed to because it was a housing association property. But she said, if they let me buy this house, I'd snap it up straight away. But she didn't want to move from where she was because it was such a lovely area. And the other person chose not to buy her house because it was on the top floor and it wouldn't be a good investment, but they bought another house, another flat elsewhere. So they clearly had a mortgage elsewhere, but not on the property they were renting. So when we take those figures into account, the numbers jump even more starkly. So we have 40% that have a mortgage or could have a mortgage. And when you compare this to general population rates, 37% of the UK population are buying a house with mortgage, or buying property with mortgage. And 32% have a freehold home, and 31%, I think, are in renting and accommodation. So the figures for mortgage and buying a house are almost the same, and if not doing a bit better in this community, in one of the most expensive areas of the world, let alone the country, to buy property in. This disadvantaged, newly arrived community is doing surprisingly well. And part of this is to do with children. And we see here this figures of 70% and 95% of children making a contribution. And I'm going to use this quote from Nurun, and same respondent 10 years apart. First time I see her, she tells me about how difficult it is. The house isn't looking great. They're really struggling. She's got lots of kids. And she says, we're on income support. We've got a mother-in-law living with us now, and we don't have any benefits for her because she's just arrived and they can't pay their bills. They're on credit cards and they're paying one off with another. They're having to wait on their bills, and she'll show me red bills. And it was really desperate, her situation. I go back 10 years later, the house has been done up. It's really glamorous. And then she says, we're really doing well. My sons work, they pay the rent. And she said, I'm not going to tell you I don't have money when we clearly do have money. You can see it for yourself. And this was just in 10 years' time. And this is to do, again, with the financial mobility of the family. The very reason for the austerity of my sample, this massive family size, 3 children, 4 children, 5, 6, 7 children, this then, in a relatively short period of time, 10 years, 20 years, translates into a huge boon for the family. All of these people are contributing. So the family system finds itself reworking in terms of a network of obligations. And lots of the people in my sample, their children are buying their own homes, but they're also buying the parental home. And all of the children are making a contribution to the parental home as a joint venture. And whereas in 2001, 70% of the children were making a contribution to the home, that was through Saturday jobs or part-time work, or it was through the older children who were at work. In 2001, all of them had adult children. And the contributions coming in from the children were from much better paid jobs, from permanent and full-time jobs. And there was only one person that didn't have contribution made from her children, and because she just didn't need it. And she was saying, if I need it, it's there, but they don't contribute, and the contribution is about regular contributions, and she said they don't make regular contributions, but if I asked them, and if I needed anything at all, they'd make that contribution. So we can see that pretty much 100% of the sample, the Bangladeshi community, that association of family obligations and that expectations, it's reworked in diaspora. So children may not live with their parents in the same house, but they run the house for them. So they will pay for any repairs that need to be done, they pay for the shopping, and they take care of the family. So the network of obligations has changed. And for many people, the finances were not about acquiring the home, it's about moving away. So they have these aspirations, like other migrant groups do, of moving into different areas. And this respondent says, we'd have moved already. They'd seen a house, they'd agreed it, and they'd arranged a mortgage and the like, but her husband sadly passed away. And she says, so we had to send the body to Bangladesh. Surprisingly still common, much less so than it was 10, 15 years ago, but surprisingly still happens. And it's an area that has that intergenerational conflict a lot more than other areas. So there's this kind of tie to the homeland of belonging and settling, but religiously there's a bit of tension about when and where people should be buried. But the body was sent back, the children went with the father and to see all of that through, and so all their money was taken up then. She said, well, we now haven't got the money for the deposit, and the bit that particularly she is put here, let them work again and save the money, and then we can do it. So the children are doing this, she's not doing it, but it's all for the benefit of the whole family. Now this one, I really like this quote, and this is from one of my respondents who talks about her daughters, and this again is the way that the extended family has been reworked in the diaspora. One of the things that the women struggled with was, when I first went to see them, it's not this one, when I first went to see them, and I spoke about their children and marriage, one of the biggest issues that they had was about, one of my respondents spoke to me specifically, and she said, the biggest problem I have is, where am I going to put my daughter-in-laws when I get my sons married? None of our sons were married at that point, and she said, look at my flat, I don't have space for them, where am I going to put them? When I went back 10 years later, she said, do you know what, none of them live here, they all chose their own wives, and none of them have chosen to live with me. And she was heartbroken, and she'd gone through depression, and it was all terrible, and all of this, and she felt really awful. So her roles that she had expected to step into as she aged didn't happen for her. But what then happens is that over time, it kind of balances out again, and there's this equilibrium as they become grandmothers, because that restores their role in the family unit. And so whereas they weren't really involved in the marriage choice in the way they wanted to be, they didn't take on the mothering role in the way that they wanted to be taking it on, they suddenly find themselves as being really useful as grandparents when their children want to go out and work, and the daughter-in-laws want to go out and work. So as the family unit has changed, and there are girls who are working outside of the home rather than staying inside of the home, this brings back the role of the mother and the matriarch in a really useful way, and reconstructs it and gives them value and respect in the way that they want. And so Safa talks about her daughters and how they go away and leave the kids with them, and how her grandkids stay with them. And in many ways, actually migration is better for older women, because if they were in Bangladesh, she probably wouldn't see her maternal grandchildren as much as the paternal grandmother would, in the way that things work and people go away to live with their husbands and the like. So certainly for women and widows, particularly the group that really benefit from migration and living in and aging in the UK. So as I kind of come towards the end, women's role in diaspora is really, really important. Childcare. And this is something that, again, in line with citizenship is really important. Women are enabling the employment of the second generation. One of the women I spoke to had 4 children. They were all married. So that's 8 adults that were going out to work, and she was looking after the grandchildren. Now, that cost that older women take of childcare, of unpaid care to people, to spouses or elderly in-laws or kids who need care, that's a huge cost they're saving the economy, and way, way more than they could ever expect to earn if they were going out to earn money. And so in terms of the contribution they make to the economy, actually they're making a huge contribution in terms of citizenship, in terms of economics as well. But as well as that, lots of women do pursue their own education and careers. And we don't see this because it's not recorded. We look at the how many women have degrees, how many women have this. But a lot of women do courses like NVQs, childcare courses, they do interpreting courses, and they work in the community. And this is really important about Tower Hamlets, is that it facilitates opportunities for migrant women and migrant communities that they wouldn't have anywhere else. And a lot of discussions about residential clustering talk about concentrated communities in very negative ways, in terms of ethnic enclaves, ghettos, in terms of being limited resources and access to spaces. But actually, residential clustering and this concentration of communities has lots of benefits for particularly two types of people. So the bookends of community, people who newly arrive and the very old, because they can then use the space in a much more safe way when you've got lots of services for your community, when you have lots of people who speak your language. So there are different parts of the communities that benefit from clustering in different ways. Middle, second generation, young people going out, maybe not so great for them to have a clustered community that's watching you all the time, but there are definitely different levels of advantage depending on where you are in society. So as well as having services with Bengali staff, in Tower Hamlets, people are very lucky. Schools have Eid holidays, workplaces have Eid holidays. You don't have to go around explaining it's like our Christmas, it's a religious thing, I'm taking the day off. That's kind of been taken as a given. Press spaces are not something that people have to feel awkward about asking about because it's understood. And Tower Hamlets has a history of trailblazing community organisations that are the envy of communities across the UK. Perhaps a victim of their own success, actually, to some degree, in that there are so many resources fighting for ever smaller resources, and so lots of these places are eventually closing down. Fabulously intricate history of housing, the GLC, as I said, the Bangladeshi Housing Association, all of that, and the response by local authorities to build bigger houses to accommodate the residents, so that relationship between people and place. The social housing in Tower Hamlets is bigger than it is elsewhere because that's what the need is here. And my particular interest around sort of older people services, as the community has aged in place, services have developed to meet the needs of that community. And what's really fascinating is how joyfully those services are received, much different to anywhere else in any other community in the UK. The people that were using those services absolutely loved them. And they say, oh, come with me and see what these services are all about. They're really good. And then people who weren't yet old enough to use these services, some of the women I spoke to were saying, I can't wait till I'm old enough to use it, because do you know what they do? They have singing, they have this, they have people who help you, they come and pick you up from your house, and they come and bring you back to your house, they take you to... So there was this general love of older people's services that you don't get anywhere else in the country. And so lots and lots of things to learn from these services. And it's all of this that has gone together to create this sense of belonging. And this is the last section that I'm looking at. Two types of belonging. Emotional belonging. I live here. This is my country. I feel really safe. And there's the formal belonging. Here's your passport. You belong here. And they take very different times to emerge. Formal belonging can be very quick, and it's very sort of, it's very cold. Whereas emotional belonging is about yourself. It comes from the person. And this sense of Britishness kind of covers both. I'm British because I have a passport, but you also have a sense of Britishness that emerges because you feel British. And this is the one that I want to look at here. 2001, I spoke to 150 plus women and asked them about how British they felt. So there were a couple of questions. One of them was about identify yourself, or how would you call yourself? And then we gave them a list of options which included British amongst them, Sylheti, Muslim, Bangladeshi, Bengali. Not one of them chose British, even when it was offered to them. 10 years later, half of them self-identified as British, or when they were given the option, but most of them, of those 50%, self-identified. And then there were the couple that when I gave them, they said, oh yeah, and British, of course. And this is really surprising. In the first instance, they'd been living here for over 20 years. And so at that point, none of them felt particularly British. Something happened in that second batch, in that 10 years period, that made them suddenly identify and own this sense of Britishness. And it's a confluence of various factors, including how long they'd been living in the UK, the fact that they now had children, and more so the fact they had grandchildren rather than children. And they felt very secure in place. And this is about the services. It's about Tower Hamlets providing old people services, about having community organisations, about having staff in shops, etc. But also that women were getting their own education and employment. And the education wasn't great. For some people, they went on and did GCSEs, but other people were doing just little courses in their colleges. And the employment that they chose, largely paid employment, revolved around childcare. But the other parts of the employments were about voluntary work, so they'd work in community organisations and the like, and they got immense value out of that. And that, again, is partly to do with the place. Where else, other than town hamlets, could a non-English speaking person go and volunteer in a community centre and get a job or look after children? The place facilitates that sense of belonging for people. So I've got a couple more quotes to end with. A woman talks about, it's about the length of stay, and she says, I feel very proud to call myself British, and this is what I really liked about the people who identified as British. They really felt this kind of sense of pride. But she says, it's because I've been living here for so long. Of course my roots are in Bangladesh, this kind of multi-layered complexity of belonging and citizenship. Of course I'm from Bangladesh and that's where my roots lie, but this is where I live, this is where I've settled, and this is where I'm going to live for the rest of my life. So now I'm British. And this one, it just shows you how important children are. Children are here, so this is my country. And as Rupa says, the last quote here, she says, I've created my own village again. So I've been here for so long, I've got my house here, and I've got my children here. So if anything happens, I know that I can wake up, my children will be here, my son-in-laws here will be here, my daughters, my entire family. So she's recreated the village that she'd left behind is now here for her. And so that's why she feels that she belongs. But it's not entirely easy, and it is negotiated and contested. As Lima says, she says, my heart tugs for Bangladesh, but what can I do? My children are here. So it doesn't matter how much I feel like I want to be in Bangladesh, I've got to stay here because I can't take my children with me. And the very last quote I have for you, I put in because it's one of the earlier quotes that I have, somebody I spoke to in 2001. And it goes back to this notion of integration and the idea that older women and first generation women don't want to integrate. But in fact, more than anyone else, they're absolutely desperate to integrate in their own way. And Nazmin talks about how her children have to integrate. They need to have the language, but not just language, they need to have both cultures. And she says it's no good for them to become totally English. They need to retain our culture, but also they can't be totally Bengali. Look at me, I'm lost in this country, what can I do? And so this idea of integration has always been important to Bangladeshi women. And very often older women are constructed as somehow restricting the opportunities for younger women. And if anything, when I was speaking to women, it was quite the opposite. And they'd say, I'm a bit worried about my daughter's wearing hijab or about the choices they're making. I don't know if this is right for them. Will they be able to get on in the world? Won't they be targeted by racism? What do you think? So very much, much more integrative and open than people think. So, as I conclude, first generation women are key to the settlement practices of our generation and our community. They are far more transformative than we think. In terms of their role as bearers of culture and tradition, yes, of course they teach us. But more than that, they also learn from the second generation and they adapt and change in lots of different ways. And one of my favourite women spoke about the first time I went to see her in 2001, was complaining about her daughters, saying, oh God, they're so British and they won't cook, they don't want to cook curries and they won't eat rice, but it's all right, they're young now, they're going to college, but when they're older, they'll learn how to cook and they'll eat rice and curry. When I went back 10 years later, she'd done all these qualifications and she was working and she was saying, oh God, who's got time to cook now? We just get sandwiches or we eat chips, we haven't got time to cook. So she'd actually taken on these aspects of her children in Western culture of it's too fussy to cook curries, let's just eat quick food. So that kind of transfer of cultural learning happens both ways. So women are absolutely pivotal in the roles they provide in the home, whether childcare or elder care and just running the home. And older women is the term that, even though I use, is contested all the time and being renegotiated in terms of who's old and who's not. But the stories of our first generation are the roots of the diaspora in this country and are really important to sort of collect and listen to. So thank you very much. And this is
Thank you for such an energetic, forceful, clear, emphatic, and lovely speech and presentation.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That's really nice and interesting. Can I have some questions, please? I think you first. Abdullah, did you want to ask something? Oh, sorry.
How did you go about finding these women? Did you have a specific community center, or how did you target them?
It was quite a long process. So the first thing I did, I'm not from Tower Hamlets, and I think that that kind of worked in my favour a lot. This kind of whole insider-outsider debate that we have in research. And so Abdullah lives at the back, used to work for a centre called the Tower Hamlets Parent Centre, and they were very kind and they gave me a seat there. And so I spoke to lots of community centres, and they were all very open to the idea of a sympathetic understanding of Bangladeshi women. There hadn't really been that kind of research before. So people, I spoke to Jagannaria, which was a women's centre, and they said people come in and just use our users and then they leave. We don't even know what happens. And I wanted to kind of be a bit more involved. So I spent much more of my time at the centres, and John Eversley, who's just there as well, was kind enough to let me have a desk at Queen Mary's. So I had an academic base here, but I spent far more time with Abdullah at his centre. And I just hung around the centre, and people began to see me. They knew what I did and that I was going to be research, but they kind of got to know me more as a member of staff at the centre. So I'd sit in on the classes, I went on their day trips to Hastings and all such things, and just hung around with women. And that's how I formulated my research ideas and questions. And so when I thought about my questions, I asked them first, what do you think about this? Is it okay to ask this? And we looked at the way that the questionnaire should be structured. And I looked at lots of things, their experiences before migration, after migration, early, all of this. So, and the women helped structure that. And then I got my first sample from there. And it was almost nobody said no. I had 100% recruitment because they knew me and they were familiar. They said yes. The second sample, the main sample that the research is based on, were randomly selected, and that was more difficult. But we approached the GP surgeries across the borough, explained our research to them, why we wanted to do it, and because it wasn't particularly, they had no agenda. It wasn't about I want to change health services. It was just I just want to find out. It was exploratory and interesting. And we asked them if we could have access to their lists of women in that age group, 35 to 55, and they allowed us to have that. Ethically, it would be much more difficult today. At the time, they said, oh, just come take the list. So I've still got their addresses and all their numbers on a computer off floppy disk at home. So it was just, at the time, it was much, much easier to do. So I got those lists. We wrote to them in Bengali and in English. We did a nice little leaflet, a really colourful thing that my brother-in-law helped with. It's a big family event, this. And we sent that out. And then I phoned them, and it took a long time. So I phoned them and I told them about my research. And so some of them had the letters, some hadn't. We have to understand that literacy isn't for everyone, but because it was in Bengali and in English, I assumed somebody might be able to read it in the house. But I phoned them and we did a sort of mini interview on the phone where I established rapport, told them what I wanted to ask. And of course, being Bangladeshi older women, they said, well, why? Why do you want to know what's interesting about my life? What do you want to know? And so I told them, well, all I want to know is about your life, about how you came, all of this. So we had long conversations, and it just took a long time, but that's what ethnographic research, if it's to be successful, has to do. And most research that tries to involve older people will send one letter or one phone call, and people say, oh, I don't know about this, and they say, oh, we couldn't reach them, they're too difficult to engage with. You have to put in the time to engage, and people will engage.
In terms of attitudes to gender equality, how did it go with this group of grandmothers in terms of how they see now the role of their granddaughters in terms of equality against men, career opportunities, community leadership? Have their opinions changed even though their role may not have changed themselves?
I think both have changed actually, and one of the things that I took out a quote before I put this together, but one of the quotes I had in there was one that said, oh, men have no power now, women have all the power. So in terms of the way the community has changed, because of the size of the community, because there are resources, and it's a very slow process. The idea, again, when we talk about citizenship and integration, it takes time. So it took one brave woman to go to language classes, to leave her children behind, and people would talk about her and whisper, and then they'd say, well, actually, she's doing all right, you know, she's got a part-time job here, and she's still managing to kind of be a Bangladeshi woman, she's covering her hair, and so people began to feel braver about doing that, so more and more numbers went. And the respondent that made that comment, she was saying that her husband had initially said, no, you can't go to language classes because people will talk. And then his mother came over from Bangladesh, and she needed to go to the doctors. And he got fed up of taking them to the doctor, and he was saying, you know what, you go to language class and you can take her to the doctor by yourself. So she did. And from that, she then went not just to language classes, but she went to a course, and now she's working at a school as a classroom assistant, so her confidence has grown. So this notion of sort of power, women feel hugely empowered, but very much to do with Tower Hamlets as a place which has enabled that for them.
Thank you.
Thrilled that you've been able to do part two of this, and
I know.
as you say.
I'm doing it every year, every decade. I've told them not to
Oh,
do that.
okay. So my next question was what's next, but just in passing, I was interviewing some Bulgarian women last night, and I just thought it'd be so interesting to do a comparative study about the new generation of migrant women and whatever. So there's another project for you, and I'll give you an offer space.
Brilliant. I'll definitely take that up.
Yes, yes.
So one of the things that I was really interested in when you contacted these women for their opinions and showed an interest in their lives, how were you perceived? I was working as an interpreter for like 2.5 years, and one of the things that I noticed is that often the men would come with the women. They were the ones explaining their symptoms, even though it was the women themselves that had the illness or needed to visit.
Yeah.
So how were you kind of perceived as a Bangladeshi woman, but slightly kind of different from what their what your expectations might be?
Yeah.
And also, like, how do you think kind of women migrating into a different culture has kind of helped or changed their sense of agency? My story is something that should be shared with the world.
There are a couple of things there. Initially, I decided that the presentation of self was very important as a researcher, and I wanted people to feel comfortable with me. So thankfully I'm very fluent in the language, so that obviously helped, but that was on the phone before they saw me. And I made a conscious decision not to cover my hair because I don't wear hijab, and I didn't feel that would be appropriate personally. But I did wear Asian clothes the first time around, absolutely. I was someone kameez I bought here in Whitechapel Market, so they could, if they said it's nice, they can say it's from there, they could recognise it. And so I was very much Tower Hamlets girl then, so I adopted that persona. They did ask me about my personal life, and I sort of was economical with the truth. I said I lived with my sister rather than saying I lived on my own, because I thought that might be a little bit too wild for them to sort of open up to me with. So it was that kind of thing. They were very excited about me being single, and there's lots of excited chatter about trying to set me up, and you just accept that that's going to be part of the whole discussion. They wanted to know all about my family, where we were from in Bangladesh, where we lived here, all of that, and you just buy into that. And the fact is, if you're asking people to tell you their stories, you have to be willing to share a story with them, whether it's the accurate story or not, but you have to be willing to be open with them. And so I think that sort of presentation of looking as traditional as possible helped. When I went back in 2011 though, I was in Tower Hamlets, and I noticed that actually girls dress very differently. You've got everything ranging from full hijab and burqa to girls that are very stylish and this kind of stylized hijabista that goes on, with nice tight clothes and big hijab, versus girls who don't wear any hijab. And so I decided to wear long dresses and jeans, that kind of thing. So it was an adaptation and an interpretation of what I saw around me again. And then in terms of sort of men getting involved, that happens a lot. So I try to time them when their husbands wouldn't be home. So that was part of the phone discussion. When are you likely to be there on your own? On the occasions husbands did come in, and I had lots, not lots, but I had a few where the husbands would say, why are you asking her? She's got nothing interesting to say, let me tell you. And then you try and avoid that, but if you can't, you're still all right, then tell me your story. And then they tell you their bit, and then they leave, because they're not that interested in knowing about family life and children and all of that. So you just allow them to say what they want to say, and you let them say their bit. And in terms of agency, actually, one of the things I found was that women have incredible agency that within the story of migration. So whilst their migration has been pre-written for them, once they marry a migrant, that's their destiny set, they're migrating. Within that, they have an enormous amount of agency about when they come. So lots of women are saying, well, I decided not to come because my parents were still alive and they didn't want me to come, or his parents were alive and I wanted to look after them. And one of my respondents was saying that her husband wanted her to come, and he couldn't go back because he owed his debtors money, people who helped him come over to this country. But she didn't come because her parents were old and she didn't want to come then. And then she thought she'd be too scared in this country because where am I going to? She's one of the earlier arrivals. But then her sister came and his brother came, and she went, by the time I came, quite a lot of my family were here, so I was happy to come. So women have a lot of agency within when to migrate and how to migrate. Also, quite a few of my women had not great marriages, and some of them chose to stay, others chose to leave. And the ones who chose to stay were by far the more interesting, because they spoke about how their families were the ones who were encouraging them to leave. So one of the women said, oh, my father already found me another husband. He said, leave him, he's not good, he gambles, he does this, so leave him, I found you someone else. And she said, well, why did you get me married there then? And she went, that's my law, I'm going to stick with him. And so women actually made that decision to stay in situations where they very much could have been allowed to leave. And the idea that Muslim women can't get divorced or shouldn't get divorced or they'll be dishonoured from the family, that didn't seem to come out hugely at all. And if you look at the research in terms of sort of divorce rates in rural areas of Bangladesh, they're coming down now, which suggests that actually they were quite high. So it's something that's accepted more than we see in the literature.
Okay, this gentleman first.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, have you thought about a comparison with Bangladesh as well? And in the sense that Bangladesh isn't a typically religious-conservative nation. Its roots are secular, although the majority in culture is Sunni Islam. So I'm kind of interested in seeing what the identity is of second, third generations in Tower Hamlets, where there's a large percentage of Bangladeshi diaspora, and whether or not that actually confers a degree of social conservatism that necessarily doesn't exist back in the motherland. In fact, Bangladesh is, albeit there are contemporary issues, nevertheless it's a far different place from Pakistan. It's a secular nation, polarity of religions, a high female literacy rates. So I wonder whether or not we're more conservative here socially, and how that improves in terms of debates on misogyny and reinforcing patriarchy within women. Because I found in my travels in Bangladesh, a lot of women who are now kind of architects, doctors, politicians, assistant deputy commissioners, and I don't think we have that access to that. We always consider Bangladesh to be quite regressive, but actually it's quite a positive. There are some positive things happening in civil society. So I was wondering whether you've seen that, and whether or not, and how that relates to the things that you've seen in Tower Hamlets.
Not that I've seen, and in terms of the community that we're looking at, in Bangladesh broadly, you're right, is so much more heterogeneous than what we see in this country. We understand sort of Bangladeshis in the UK as being mainly Sylheti because of the numbers of Sylheti people that have migrated. But in terms of the Bangladeshi population, Sylhetis make up about 9% of the entire population, so a really small number of the 170 million people that live in Bangladesh. And in terms of the social conservatism, I think that's really interesting. I think that there was a time, possibly around the mid-90s, early 2000s, when there was a huge chasm between the two, when the Islamism of Tower Hamlets had begun to take off, and it was a time when the older generation were really confused about what was going on. So they covered their hair with the end of their sari, with a scarf. It was all quite laid back, and it was more cultural than it was religious. And then suddenly this notion of a globalized Islam and wearing hijab really tightly, and this idea that there's an appropriate or a really Islamic way to wear your hijab, which some of the women said, oh, it's not Islamic, it's cultural, it's the culture of Tower Hamlets, that's how they wear it here, it's not Islamic. So there's this kind of confusion over that. And at that point, when they were traveling back to Bangladesh, there was this difference because the second generation, or the comparative generation there, weren't wearing hijab. Neither were the older women wearing hijab, nor were their daughters. It wasn't part of the culture there. But because of this globalization of Islam, of the message of the media, and of the constant to and fro transnational migration, that message has now gone back to Bangladesh, and there is a growing conservatism that we see in the Sylheti community there. So that adoption of a full hijab, of younger women again and again taking that sort of religious identity
It's
in
like
terms
the Saudi
of
workers in the previous generation,
Yeah.
Saudi imported.
Yeah, they're
British
importing this
Bangladesh
notion of this kind of globalized, this idea of an essentialized Islam, but it's not really essentialized. It's not returning to the roots of Islam in any way. It's more a notion of this diasporic Islam that's being, it's sort of a globalized Islam that's happening at the moment that seems to be across, traveling across global media rather than a return to anything that is an essential Islam.
That's very interesting. My kind of contention is, and I don't know what the answer is, so that's the beauty of it, is whether or not this kind of globalized Islam is something that is quite a tad bit fantastical, in the sense that, is it something a bit like, I suppose, in 1947, the idea that Muslims can't live in a majority Hindus. And that view was kind of imposed by minority Muslims. So the minority condition somehow unsettles the Muslim mind. And actually there's no reflection in Islamic history where it should do. But unfortunately, with symbolism and instrumentalism, I think sometimes this kind of minority setting can set.
I think we're seeing it now. We know that Bangladesh is a secular country, but then you see this rise of this far-right Islamism, and it just doesn't feel like a safe place. Anybody who expresses a view that is secular seems to be constantly threatened. So I think there is a very dangerous rise of this extremism that seems to be showing itself in Bangladesh, and with very little response from the government to sort of try and combat that, because people are scared of seeming anti-Islamic if they try to combat in any way. So I think it's a very difficult time, and uncertain times for sure. I don't know.
That personally, yes.
Thank you. I had the pleasure of seeing your research, I think 15 years ago. So it's fantastic to see the depth and the range that you now cover. And I guess along these 15 years, you've also had what's happening in the UK around the world of migration, where it's women, where it's minorities. It's amazing to see that your research has also been part of this journey. What I now find fascinating is what are the comparisons to other migrants, and the differences and similar. But more interestingly, coming back to these steps, which is where the study is located, do you draw parallels between the role of mothers and daughters in writing steps, and how they actually provided a safety net for that community to move on and prosper and so on, and the role that our migrants and that particular generation that you're focusing on actually providing fulfilling that safety net, especially in a period when austerity has hit us. And that contribution that our mothers made is, I would say, fantastic, and it hasn't been quantified.
No, I agree with you, absolutely.
More at that.
And it's far more than not just being quantified. It's almost that they're vilified for not being out in the employment sector, not engaging in a way that is seen to be appropriate. So why aren't you out working? When, like I say, the contribution they make to the economy is massive. The way they enable the next generation and support them, and is something that we cannot quantify. But nobody seems to want to quantify it as well, because it makes sense, and it's much easier to vilify some part of the community and say, oh, that's where the fault lies. They're not integrating, so let's blame them. We always need a scapegoat, and the people who can't respond for themselves, they're the easiest ones to scapegoat. And I think that's where our communities find themselves. And because the nature of that older generation is to keep your head down and just let it pass. So that's, it's a toughie.
Yeah, could you tell us more about your research group, the ethnic composition, and your experience as a person of color in white academia?
My research group, as in the people I research?
No, as in the people, your co-workers, your colleagues.
The second part was done just by myself. The first part was with Nilufer.
It's a broader question.
Oh, broader question. Right now, Swansea University, it's just me. And it's not big on ethnicity, but it is in Wales. And I'll tell you, there are two stories that I'll tell you, which will give you an idea of where I'm at. One of them was not this university, but another university, and I didn't go to the Christmas party for lots of reasons, as you'll all be able to understand. But one of the things that we were asked to do, and they were very difficult about me not going to the Christmas party and the like, but one of the party games that we were asked to contribute to was to send a baby photograph of ourselves in, so that people could guess the baby. Now, 40 people, I'm the only brown one. So this made me feel uncomfortable. And they were saying, we can play the game before we go. And I was thinking, but you know, how is it that? And I thought they were all going to be really polite and pretend they haven't recognised me. And it's just going to be really awkward for everybody. So I just thought, no, I won't do that. And then more recently in my university, we changed buildings and I had to move. And I moved into a really big building. And I walked in and one day, and the receptionist who I was hired by, she went, oh, you've got a letter. And I said, oh, have I? And she went, well, I think it's for you. There's a name on it, and of course I'm the only one with a funny name, so it must be for me, because I'm not called Jones or Davis or whatever else. So that's kind of what we have. There's nothing sinister in it, but you always...
No, because I'm turning the lens on the people who study us, rather than, how is the people who are studied.
Well, it's my research is seen as great, because I have 100% response rate and recruitment rate and people engage, but I don't do anything particularly, it's not about me, it's about my method, which if you employ as a white person, as somebody who doesn't speak the language, if you take that time with people, if you're willing to engage and find the platform that people respond to you on, then they will respond. You know, it's about, people talk about Asian people don't use health services or elder people services. It's because you haven't told them about them. They're not appropriate. As soon as they become appropriate, as soon as they meet your needs, they'll use them. They don't care who's providing it. If it meets the needs that you have, you use them. And so I think it's about that kind of balance. And I do struggle with it, and I do find myself constantly, like I say, having to explain what Eid is. And I'm coming to that time of year again, we go, no, not even water, you know, it's just nothing at all, no food, no water. No, it's not 30 days straight, it's down till, you know, this is something that you have to do again and again. But it's just part of, you know, what you have to do. And
Can I just come in?
Sorry, Chandra, we're running out of time. But last one.
I'm lost. So I apologize, I'm very late, so I didn't look before. But so I don't know. But in light of, and I know you're a researcher of the East End and citizenship, particularly, a subject touted by the Blair government after a clear-cut racist policy. It has now 15 years later, after all the pundits have been paid money to essentialize the Bangladeshi community, particularly, has been pretty much exposed outside of academia. I'm sure academia is catching up. I'm sure you are at the forefront. But I wonder, so I didn't know your research, so I'm not sure, if the notion of the biased majority society and the historical forgetting of the origination of non-white people in Britain out of 300 years of actual citizenship to this country, which implies taxation, which because of the media and to some extent, to be honest, the academic narrative of the last 15 years seems to, I remember 1999 very well, I'm not from Southampton. So I have families that have been educated, fortunately, for 3 generations, and they're all women. So I always found it interesting to see my movement through upper middle class life, and then the post 9/11 era, which seems to me, to be honest, in the context of domestic analysis, or in this case, British-Bangladeshis, on the day that a Punjabi Brit in South London has been elected to the mayor of London, who's Muslim, that there is a problem, not so much in academia, but in the majority society's capacity, manipulated by the media, historical forgetting that non-white people are arguably more British than many of the recent European, legally speaking, European immigrants, and that the base root assumptions of the last 15 years has been a fundamentally supremacist in the media and in general narrative, racist global narrative, clearly funded by Clinton. And the reason I ask this is I often think that despite the phenomenal excellent research, there is an assumption injected into the wider matrix of academia and media of the foreignness and otherness of effectively people who are not white.
yeah.
And in light of that,
For people to explore different places to live and different opportunities for their
I'm
children.
welcoming this. I'm just wondering. I remember people not feeling their leave after 30, 40 years struggle.
Yeah.
And I do feel for the younger generation, not so much the youngsters, but let's say the 30-year-olds with kids, there is a sense of complete unwelcomeness.
That's media, like you recognise.
Well, I just had it about 10 minutes ago parking my car in a very Washington lady who was shocked that I speak English. But I've been speaking English like that.
Hamlet.
Absolutely, the hipsters.
Yeah.
You know, and business owners. And it's not just the individuals out there. It's the notion, no, it's not the point. Everyone's a special case like we are. But it's the notion of our essential foreignness.
Well, I think that's
the
best example I can give. I was chatting to Abdul earlier. We in Wales, where I come from,
Right.
where I now live, in southwest Wales, we've elected UKIP for our National Assembly.
Oh,
we have
God.
6 members to the National Assembly now. Now, when I do a lot of research, I'm a psychologist as well, and one of the last piece of work has been doing in southwest Wales, where it's incredibly white, a really homogenous community. And this is one of the issues I have with women or migrants must learn English. Lots of the communities I work with only speak purely Welsh. They're hugely homogenous. They don't move or integrate with anyone outside of their own communities, but nobody's telling them they have to
But
speak English.
hipsters aren't integrating with their...
Exactly, hipsters are their own
No,
breed.
we talk about, Muslims not integrating. Let's talk about the problem of hipsters.
Well, it's not. I mean, on a serious note, we have large communities of Greek older women, Spanish older women, Italian older women who don't speak a word of English, have lived here for 40 years. Nobody's pointing at them saying, you're the problem, why haven't you integrated, you're really problematic. They're just living the same way as older Bangladeshi women do, or older Pakistanis do, looking after their families, trying to get on. But suddenly our Muslim women are problematic, but other people aren't. So it is all about racist discourse and very much about the media.
It's about political point scoring.
We really have to stop it.
Thank you very, very
really
much.
good chat today.